Welcome to tonight's UW Showcase Lecture. My name is Kate Szymanensky, and I'm a program manager at the Wisconsin Alumni Association. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight on behalf of Capitol Lakes Retirement Community, as well as the Wisconsin Alumni Association, to have you here in-house tonight. And also a special welcome to everybody that is joining us online tonight for our live webcast. Tonight, we welcome Jon Pevehouse, a professor of political science here at UW-Madison. His focus is on the link between international institutions and their political economic outcomes, whether at the domestic or international level. Pevehouse has recently been published on the topics of reciprocity in regional conflicts, regional trade agreements, international influences, and economic interdependence. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jon Pevehouse.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks to the Alumni Association for inviting me to this event. Thank you all for coming. Indeed, it's supposed to be spring out there. Starting to think Mark Twain was really writing about Madison. He said the coldest winter I ever spent was summer in Madison. But tonight we're here to talk a little bit about the Middle East, and I also would like to talk just generally about American foreign policy. And I won't go on too long. In fact, I'm going to keep timing. I know you've never heard a professor say they're going to stop talking. But I will not go on too long because I'm anxious to talk about issues that you're interested in and answer your questions. The topic of tonight's talk is about the Middle East. I'll start with the Middle East. I'll probably end in North Korea, which we should probably talk about, and maybe even hit a few things in between. But I want to begin with the Middle East, and then obviously anything you all want to talk about. But I want to begin with the Middle East. And in the Middle East, there are basically three issues I want to talk about. I want to talk about Syria, of course, where there's been a tremendous amount of bloodshed over the last 2+ years. I want to talk a little bit about Egypt, where there's still kind of a rocky transition, governmental transition going on there. Then I want to talk a little bit about Israel and how these two conflicts are kind of catching Israel in between. And of course, Israel has its own domestic political situation that it's trying to deal with and demographic situation that it's trying to deal with. Then we may or may talk, I'm happy to talk about Turkey in the Q&A. I think there's a lot of very interesting things going on in the country of Turkey right now. And then finally, I do want to talk about North Korea, because obviously until these very unfortunate events in Boston, that was what was getting the headlines. So let's start with Syria. So I'll start the narrative of Syria in March of 2011, which is when a civil conflict broke out in March of 2011. The way this started was in the southern city of Deray, which is on the Jordanian border, and there were a bunch of school children who, in the midst of the Arab Spring, which was going on at the time in Egypt and in Tunisia and even in Yemen and beginning in Libya, a bunch of Arab school children in Deray wrote "Down with the Assad regime" on the side of their school in spray paint. The response from the Syrian authorities was to find these kids and arrest them and beat a couple of them publicly. And the response from the population of this town was a large-scale uprising, relatively peaceful. But again, this was met with Syrian force. This was met some pretty deep Syrian force levels against this population in Deray. What was interesting is that in Deray, they had rebelled before. The 1970s, there were a number of cities that had undergone a small rebellion about the time that Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current leader, Bashar Assad, had come to power. Assad in the 70s and 80s was ruthless in suppressing these rebellions in these towns like Deray, in Hama, which you may have read about in Tom Friedman's book From Beirut to Jerusalem, has a fascinating story of what happened in Hama in 1982. There's a rising of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it's estimated that the Syrian army killed anywhere from 20 to 40,000 people in about a 3-day period. And this was absolutely no dissension was allowed under this regime, and we'll get to why in a minute. So there was a fear that this is exactly what's going to happen again. You're going to get some local rebellions in Syria, and the current regime would put them down, Maybe, though, he would hold out an olive branch. Bashar Assad, the current leader of Syria, was thought for many years in the United States and in Europe to perhaps be a progressive leader. Yes, his father was a brutal dictator, but his father was quite shrewd as the leader of Syria, and the expectation was he was not quite as shrewd, and that because he couldn't rely on his shrewdness, he may eventually have to open up the country a little, maybe not democratize, but maybe open the press, maybe open up for some opposition parties. And when this initially happened, there was a lot of folks in the West, believe it or not, in March of 2011 who said, well, maybe this will end up like Egypt. Maybe this will end up like Tunisia. But in fact, Syria was not Egypt. Syria was not Tunisia. And things ended up going very poorly for those who rebelled in Syria. As I said, the Syrian army brutally cracked down on these rebellions. But much to everyone's surprise, they were resilient. These protesters were resilient. They stayed in the streets. The protests spread. They spread to Homs. They spread to Hama. They spread to many of the other western cities. They spread to the outskirts of Damascus, the capital. And so that really began the uprising against the current Assad regime. The uprising, it is estimated since March of 2011. No one knows for sure how many have died. Probably the best estimate I've seen of this from the United Nations estimates that about 70,000 folks have died in this rebellion to date. It shows let me kind of get to the end here, and then we'll backtrack. It's not going to end peacefully. My prediction is this will not end peacefully. It will wind down once one side is finally strong enough to crush the other. Why is that the case? That goes back to the nature of the regime. When Hafez al-Assad came to power in 1970, in other words, the father of the current leader of Syria, when Assad came to power in 70, he was a member of an ethnic minority called the Alawi, or the Alawites. The Alawites are part of the Shia sect, the Shia group of Islam, except that they have a slightly different set of beliefs than what I would call the mainstream Shia. And they only make up 12% of the population. Syria has four main population groups. They're 74% Sunni Muslim. They are 12% Alawi, which is again a sect of Shia. They are 10% Christian, and 3% Druze, which Druze are again a Shia sect that is quite rare and exists mostly in Lebanon and in parts of western and northwestern Syria. So Assad comes to power in 1970, and he immediately puts his family and his Alawi brethren in power. They lead the military. They lead the parliament. They lead all of the key financial sectors. And every time the Sunni Muslims begin to kind of rise up and say, well, look, we need more power. We're the vast majority in this country. Assad puts them down. Again, he puts them down in the 70s in Dareh. He puts them down in the 80s in Hama and in other places as well. So you've got 12% of the population running the entire country. The other 74% have very few rights. They have very few access to, say, economic materials. They have less access to schooling, etc. And again, time and time again, whenever the 74% has come up and said, hey, we want more rights, we want a better economy, that 12% has largely suppressed them with the military. So, so Hafez al-Assad, the father, made a career out of it for 30 years until he stepped down and gave room to his son in 2000, gave over power to his son in 2000. So if you think about it from the Alawi's perspective, for the last 43 years, they have been in power, ruling this country, suppressing everyone who tries to stand against them. What do you think that they think is the first thing that's going to happen the minute they give up power? Right? Nothing good to them. Those 74% are going to rise up and they're going to take their revenge. So if you think about it from their perspective, why doesn't Bashir Assad, the current president of Syria, step down? Why doesn't he negotiate some peaceful power sharing, some peaceful transition? He doesn't trust the other side, nor should he. The other side doesn't trust him. Right? There's absolutely no trust. Now you've had 2+ years of civil war, of killing the other side, of their targeting civilian populations on both sides. And so from that perspective, I draw the analogy to the Libya war that happened recently. My and several of my colleagues' predictions at that point was that, the line I used was that Muammar Gaddafi is not leaving Libya unless he's in a pine box. And that's exactly what happened. And I think the same thing will be said of Bashir Assad. He's not leaving Syria unless he's in a pine box, which is unfortunate because that means there's going to have to be a grind on in the fighting. There's going to have to be some type of military breakthrough for the rebels to win. Which brings up an interesting question. Who are these rebels? Why are they fighting? Where are they getting their weapons from? You can't, just sort of find weapons like they're using lying around. You can't find anti-aircraft missiles lying around. This is, I think, one of the more fascinating parts of the Syria war, which is the outside interests that are involved directly in the war. Who are these outside interests are channeling their weapons and their money either to the government or to these rebels. So the rebels are the major rebel group that you will hear discussed in the media is the Free Syrian Army. The Free Syrian Army are a group mostly of military officers who used to be in the Syrian military. Many of them are Sunni. They are not Alawi. They are Sunni. Sunnis were allowed in the Syrian military. They could only serve in particular geographic regions, right? They could only serve amongst one another, right, essentially. So that was the safe place to keep them. But some of them actually eventually did. When the Assad regime felt their loyalty was not questionable, many of these Syrian military officers were allowed to rise through the ranks, even though they were Sunni. So now you've got a number of those folks who have defected from the Assad regime, and they're now leading this army against Assad. They're taking any able-bodied, frankly, man, woman, or child they can get, and they're trying to train them to fight the army. They have a major disadvantage, which is that they don't have air power. The Syrian army has a strong air force. This air force has been used in places like Aleppo and the outskirts of Damascus. You probably have seen some of these horrible pictures of the bombings that have taken place by the Syrian Air Force, Army Air Corps, to go after these rebellions, to go after these rebel groups and the neighborhoods they live in. How do they know the neighborhoods they live in? Well, again, it's all ethnically based. There are certain cities that are predominantly Sunni. There are certain neighborhoods that are predominantly Sunni. The regime assumes if this is a predominantly Sunni neighborhood and they've seen some rockets or some guns coming out of this neighborhood, that will be bombed, right? That must be part of the rebel movement. So they're at a disadvantage. The Syrians are getting the Syrian army had been armed to the hilt for some time. For many years during the Cold War, they were an ally to the Soviet Union. And they had spent a large portion of their GDP buying weapons from the Soviets during the Cold War. After the Cold War, they continued to buy weapons, ironically, even more weapons, because the Russians were willing to sell them cheap. The Russians needed the money. So the Syrians had money, and they were willing to buy them, a lot of them, from Russia. And so you saw a large transfer of weapons going into Syria. They also get some help from the Chinese, although not a lot. But Russia's kind of one of their main allies. So the rebels then fighting are trying to get help. Who are they trying to get help from? They're getting a lot of help from Saudi Arabia, and they're getting a lot of help from Qatar, the small Gulf monarchy in the Persian Gulf. Why is Saudi Arabia funneling so many dollars? They're not funding a whole lot of weapons, but they're funneling money. Money's fungible. Money buys anything, including weapons, on the black market. Why are they funding this rebellion? They're funding the rebellion because the other country helping Syria, besides Russia, is Iran. And Saudi Arabia and Iran dislike one another quite extensively. So Syria sees this as, the enemy of the enemy is my friend. And so therefore, they're going to put a lot of resources into Syria because the Syrian government likes Iran, and they want Syria to fall so Iran loses an ally. Right? So it's sort of this great game of chess kind of that's going on. Qatar is the same way. Qatar fears its own Shia. Qatar is majority Shia, as is Iran. And Qatar, if you recall, actually put down a rebellion during the Arab Spring with Saudi help. The Iranians threatened to retaliate against Qatar, so Qatar would like nothing more than to see some of Iran's friends fall. So, again, you've got this chess game. So you've got the Saudis, the rebels, and the Qataris on one side. You've got the Russians, the Syrians, and Iranians on the other. Where's the U.S. in this? Where are the British in this? Where are the French in this? We're pretty much over here, with the Saudis, with the Qataris, with the rebels. But we're not completely with them. And this has been getting a lot of attention in the U.S. press the last 6 months. Why doesn't Obama, or why doesn't Cameron, why doesn't the French Prime Minister open the floodgates to U.S. military assistance to these rebels? Why aren't we doing more training of the rebels? Why aren't we providing them more anti-aircraft weapons? Right? I mean, this is what they need. They need They need these missiles, these Stinger missiles you hold on your shoulder and you fire after airplanes. Side story. We've been in this situation before, where we had some rebels rebelling against someone helped by the Russians, where there was massive imbalance in air power, and they were bombing, and the rebels, and we really wanted this government to fall, and so we got a bunch of rebels together, we armed them, we gave them a bunch of anti-aircraft missiles, we had a local friend helping us do this named Pakistan, and that group was called the Mujahideen, right, which eventually became Al-Qaeda. Right? We don't want to do that again. And the concern of Syria is that is exactly what would happen. Because we know amongst that Free Syrian Army, there are a lot of individuals who pay their allegiance to Islamic fundamentalist movements, to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, to these other movements who would threaten U.S. interests. This is why Obama has convinced the French and the British not to sell or give a lot of weapons to the rebels. We have a bad feeling of where those will end up. They will end up in Afghanistan, being used against U.S. troops. They will end up in Iraq, fomenting more revolution there. Or they will make their way across the border to Hamas, who will then use them against Israel. Right? It's a very mixed rebel group. And it's a rebel group that, right, they all agree on something, which is that they want the government to go away. It's unclear, let's say tomorrow the government goes away, it's unclear to me that Free Syrian Army and those rebels could actually agree what would come next. In this group are communists, there are nationalists, there are small d, people who want a democracy, they want like an American-type democracy. There are Islamic fundamentalists, you name it. There are Kurds, right, who want an independent Kurdistan in Syria. Right? They all agree who their enemy is, yet they're not sure who their friends are within that group. So that's the strategic danger. That's why the U.S. has been so slow and so deliberate in acting to get involved in Syria. About 2 months ago, reports are that now we are helping to train. We're not arming the rebels, but we are training some of the rebels who have come across the border into Jordan. We're working closely with the Jordanian government. Ironically, there are also some reports coming out that neither side will... So there's reports coming out that Israel is actually giving a little bit of help to the rebels in terms of medical care. Israel's kind of denying this, the rebels are denying this, but all the reports are that this is actually happening, that whenever there's a major battle near the Golan Heights, which is the Syrian border with Israel, that in fact the Israelis are kind of coming across there, they're gathering up the Syrian rebels, they're bringing them back sometimes to hospitals in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, they're treating them, and then they're sending them back. And they're gladly accepting this. But of course, the Israelis are no dummies. They know that when the Free Syrian Army comes to power, and it probably will at some point, they're not going to call up Israel and be friends. That's not going to happen. Yet, Israel feels like there's so much instability right now that they would rather just have someone finally win. And pretty much all analysts think that it's eventually going to be the rebels. It's just a matter of time. Final thing to mention with Syria. Syria has a large stockpile of chemical weapons, right, which makes everyone very nervous. This is Israel's main interest in ending this rebellion as soon as possible, because not that the rebels would use them against Israel, probably not even that Assad would use them against Israel, because he knows that would be suicidal for himself. But rather just the fear that in this chaos, in this sort of lack of controlled atmosphere, who knows who could walk away with some of this stockpile of chemical weapons. Chemical weapons are not like nuclear weapons in that you don't need a large infrastructure to take care of them. You put them in a briefcase and you walk off and then release them on a subway. You release them in a city or release them in an office building. Release them on a windy day in Tel Aviv or in Beirut, and you've got a lot of trouble on your hands. So the international community has been very concerned about these chemical weapons. There were some reports about 9 months ago that these weapons were being moved. U.S. and Israel and even the Russians are keeping a very close eye on this, that some of these weapons had been taken around and moved, possibly for deployment and use. Assad denies this. After this leaked, actually, the CIA director at the time leaked this, and after this got out and hit the international press, they actually quickly discovered that within 2 days they had all sort of been moved back. So, and they were moved back because Russia and Iran, but Russia in particular told Syria, that's a red line, right? We will support you, we will help you diplomatically, we might even give you money to try to keep you in power, but if you use chemical weapons, all bets are off. We will move against you. We will cut you off. That is a bridge too far. So there's at least some hope that that message got through, and that in some fit of desperation, the Assad regime at the end of the game will not use these weapons to try to bail themselves out. I think that is unlikely. I really do think that is unlikely. So that's Syria in a nutshell. Okay, deep breath. All right. I will spend much less time on the other two places in the Middle East, but one is Egypt. Last summer, actually in March of 2011, there was a constitutional referendum. We all remember Cairo and the uprising in Cairo during the Arab Spring and the fall of Hosni Mubarak, who was recently bound over for trial. That's been in the news this week. So you get a new constitution written in 2011. You had some elections brought to power Mohammed Morsi, who sort of is a self-declared Islamist, but it's someone he's not anti-Western whatsoever. He claims he wants to rule consistent with Islamic values, and actually has shown no signs that he's in league with any sort of Islamic extremists by any stretch. You've got a couple of main groups in Egypt. I would say you've got four main groups to think about in Egypt. One is the kind of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is the Islamic political movement. The Brotherhood is massive. When you hear the phrase Muslim Brotherhood, the first thought many people have is, they're kind of an anti-West terrorist organization. In Egypt, that's less true. There certainly are a number of leaders in the Brotherhood who are incredibly anti-Western. They are anti-Israeli. They would like nothing more than to end the peace treaty with Israel. But I would say that's a minority in that group. Many of them are even Western educated. They just believe that they just don't believe in the separation of church and state, right? That's one way to think about it. They believe Islam should inform government and should provide social services. They actually span, if you put them on the political spectrum in the U.S., some of them would be very conservative, sort of Republican leaning, some of them would be very Democratic. It's a very heterogeneous group politically, but they're large and they're very powerful. And so far they've won most elections. Not tied to them are actually what I would call sort of the new generation of Egyptian political leaders. These were the folks you saw that led the charge out in Tahrir Square in Cairo. These are the bloggers. These are the folks who sort of identify more with sort of Western ideas about governance and democracy. Yet they're young. They don't have key allies where they need them. So even though they're large and they're still out there fighting, they're not making a lot of inroads. But they will be and continue to be some force to be reckoned with for some time. The closest person aligned with them who is more senior is a guy named Mohammed al-Baradei, who is the IAEA. He ran the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, for many years. And he's kind of the biggest figurehead that leads that group. Then you've got the military. The Egyptian military is probably the most powerful political institution in Egypt. They're large. They're about 500,000 people. Some estimates are that they control anywhere from 30 to 40% of the GDP. In other words, 30 to 40% of all businesses are owned by the Egyptian military in Egypt. They're incredibly powerful. They have their finger in every pot. And because of that, and because Egypt is a large economy, it's a large country, the Egyptian military wants peace, they want governance, they don't want sanctions, and they are kind of keeping their finger on the scale, balancing between the different groups. Morsi, the president, has tried to take their finger off the scale a couple of times. So far, he's largely failed. And so that's why you have this sort of, I would call it an unstable you have an unstable situation, you have an unstable but quiet situation in Egypt, in that no one's really going to do anything rash, yet no one's quite happy with how things are. The Brotherhood and the Islamists want a little more power, the military thinks they have a little too much already, and I still think we're a year or two away from really seeing anyone make a decisive move in the power struggle there. The fourth group, I'll just mention quickly, are the Copts, the Coptic Christians in Egypt. They make about 10% of the population. They're active politically. They tend to be sort of a political football. They want protection. They want protection for their religion. They want protection for their ethnic rights. And they're going to kind of align with anyone they feel that's going to do that. They've been more aligned with sort of the younger folks, democracy folks. They were active in the rebellion They were active in the Arab Spring. But yet they also know they're only 10% of the population, and they could easily be run over by one of these other groups. So they're trying to play it smart politically. Once in a while, you will see one of their churches burned, or there'll be a demonstration outside one of their churches. They have pressed Morsi consistently to make sure this doesn't happen, to protect them. So far, he's been okay at responding to that. I think if you get a major incident against Copts and he doesn't respond well, you will see them rebel, and you will see them really try to push again. Some new line there. Okay. Israel, quickly. Israel, right, is sitting in the middle of all of this. They're sitting in the middle of Egypt. They're sitting in the middle of, between Egypt and Syria. They've got Jordan to one side, and they've got Lebanon, who they've invaded twice to the north, ruled by Hezbollah, who is sort of their sworn enemy, and vice versa. What is the Israeli situation? Well, the Israeli situation, was it 2 days ago, some rockets landed in Eilat, in Israel, that were fired out of the Sinai. The Sinai is sort of a no man's land at this point. Egypt has very little control over it. There's just these really are, I guess the equivalent would be, so the Old West. This is the Old West in the United States, right now in the Sinai. The Egyptian army has little control. They don't care about it that much. The Israelis don't like the fact that Egypt doesn't have control, but they're not going to go and do anything about it. They gave up the Sinai. They're done with that. And then you've got Gaza bordering the Sinai. And, Israel clearly wants nothing to do with Gaza. It was so controversial when Israel pulled out of Gaza, but what people forget is Shamir tried to give Gaza to Egypt in Camp David. Like, he begged them to take it, and they refused. And so, Israel has never wanted Gaza, right? Egypt doesn't want Gaza. No one wants Gaza because it's mostly, it is imagine a city that is its own entity that is incredibly poor, no resources what to speak of, and it's mostly camps at this point. That's where Egypt kind of plays a role in, how tight are they going to keep that border in Gaza, because Hamas controls Gaza. Okay, so Israel. There's a lot to say, but there's not much new things to say about the Israeli situation. I'll kind of back up and think long term. Israel is surrounded by, it has one state, Jordan, which is friendly. And even though, yes, you get back and forths, that the Israelis and the Jordanians call each other the cousins. When you talk to Israeli military officials in the IDF, or you talk to Jordanian, like RAF pilots, they'll say, we'd fly over there, but we'd have to tell the cousins first. They do, even though there's sort of this, it seems like a tension, Israel and Jordan have gotten along. They've always, frankly, gotten along under the table. They'll continue to get along. The only fear there is that the Jordanian regime becomes unstable at some point. It's a fascinating article about King Hussein in The Atlantic a couple of months ago, and how he's trying to balance everything going on with Syria and Israel and Egypt. The Israeli situation is this. They have a demographic problem. Right. Within the next generation, Jews will be the minority in Israel. And if it's no longer a Jewish state, what is Israel? Right. And this is the million-dollar question. I've been in Israel. I've been in the Middle East a couple times in the last year, going back in a few months. And, all of the Israeli leaders, they put on a good face, but yet they know they will always also say, look, we're in an unstable region. We've got this demographic problem, and this is why you get the wall. Right, this is why you get the security guarantee, the self-security guarantees of Israel. That said, the economy is doing great. The Israeli economy is growing at breakneck speed. People are largely employed. It's high tech. Right, Apple is getting ready to open a major factory, an R&D center there. They are high tech. They are advanced in agriculture. There's a lot going well for them economically. They survived the 2008 financial crisis. They've survived the Greek collapse. One of their biggest trading partners 2 years ago was Greece. They survived the collapse of the Greek economy. But again, you've got a situation where it's no longer, in another generation or two, going to be a strictly Jewish state, and where at that point about 50% of the population doesn't work. Right? Think about that. Right? Those who are Orthodox do not work, and the state pays them not to work. It's paid to study. So you've got a society where a quarter of the population, right, half are Arab, a quarter are secular, right, and a quarter are not secular, and that one quarter doesn't work, and the other Arab population has about a 45% unemployment rate. That's the big picture question. And that's not about Lebanon. That's not about Iran and their nukes. That's not about, that is about an internal situation within Israel that they have to think about how to deal with politically and economically. And it's not, people are thinking hard about this. They're trying to figure this out, exactly how to handle this, but it's a big deal. Okay. All right. So the next 10 minutes or so, I'll finish up on North Korea. So again, this was the headline, right? Until this terrible event in Boston a couple of days ago, it was all about North Korea. And you'll notice, ironically, did anyone see the headline today? North Korea says, now we want to talk, right? It's like, we're not getting the headline anymore. Let's change the narrative. Now we want to talk. And that's really what this is about. The North Korean regime under Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong Il previously and Kim Il-sung before him, they always, this is about trying to bargain for more goods. North Korea is they call it the Hermit Kingdom for a reason. I've never been. I have a very, very good friend who, just on a complete lark, he studies Central Europe, actually, a colleague of mine who teaches at Berkeley. And I said, last spring, I said, what are you doing this summer? And he says, I'm going to go to North Korea. Like, you can't go to North Korea. And he's like, yeah. And so it turns out there are these Chinese tourist agencies that will take Americans one at a time to North Korea. So he paid an arm and a leg just to say he's been to North Korea. And he got back and I flew him, he came and gave a talk, and he was supposed to be talking on his research on actually Catholicism in 19th century Central Europe. But instead, everyone just asked him about North Korea. It's like, you went to North Korea? And the stories he had are just unbelievable to get just a slice of what's going on in there. So, he lands on this plane. He gets off. He's the only American on the plane. He's immediately met by a handler and a guide, right? 2 people. Those 2 people never left his sight unless he was asleep in his room. And even then, he was pretty sure that one of them was in the room next to him the whole time in his hotel. They never left his sight. They knocked on his door in the morning. They ate breakfast with him. They ate lunch with him. They ate dinner with him. They would take him to lunch at a restaurant. Let's say this was the restaurant. This many people in the restaurant would walk in. The handler would snap his fingers. Everyone left. And he sat down, right? Because they did not want someone talking to an American, right? That was outside information that would be bad for them. It is extreme, right? Right? Think about it like this. Kim Jong Il, the current leader of North Korea, the current dear leader, there was one photograph of him on the day he became the dear leader, right? When this announcement, Kim Jong Il has died, Kim Jong-un is the next president, no one had a picture of him. No one. There was one picture of him, right, that they then released. That's all. No one had seen this person before. That is unfathomable in the internet age, right? No one had taken a picture of this man. And there was supposed to be pictures of him, right? So, it's extreme. So you get that said, it's extreme. It's the authoritarianism like we've probably never seen before or will never see again. That said, there are still power struggles. I think we often make the mistake that in these brutal dictatorships, whether it's Saddam Hussein or Kim Jong-il or Mao or even like a Zimbabwe, like a Mugabe in Zimbabwe, we think, that's this one person, right? Or Hitler, right? It's one person who controls everything. It's impossible for one person to control an entire nation. That cannot happen. He needs underlings. She needs underlings. They need a staff. They need the military to be in their pocket. That takes politics, even in a dictatorship, right? Not everyone just sort of pays allegiance to the person, even in North Korea. And so what we think we know about North Korea, even though it's so closed off, is that the reason Kim Jong-un has come in, and literally since the day he's come into office, he said all these crazy things. He's going to declare nuclear war on the United States. He's going to invade South Korea. He's going to go to war against Japan. He said all these crazy things, goes the belief, in that he's got these senior military folks who are 3 times his age. Right. They're 75, 80-year-old military leaders who really do control the military. Right. These are the folks in North Korea who control the nuclear weapons. He wants to show them he's tough. Right. He doesn't look tough. If you've seen pictures of him, he doesn't look tough. But he wants to show them he's tough and that he knows what he's doing and that he knows how to play the diplomatic game. So what does he do? He runs out there, right, kind of like, I shouldn't say this. I have a 6-year-old at home. He runs out there like a 6-year-old, right, when he doesn't get what he wants, and he throws a temper tantrum, right? And that's exactly what this is, right? The only thing he did, and the only thing that happened during this last crisis that was even remotely worrisome to people who have watched North Korea was he shut down a joint production factory at Kaesong, And that was something that they'd kind of only done in the past when they really did start to mobilize. And so there was some concern over that. But again, there was I won't say too many things about this, but a former University of Wisconsin professor wrote an editorial last week suggesting that it is now time for the U.S. to begin a war against North Korea. I think that's ridiculous for a number of reasons. Even if, I'm not saying you should like the North Korean regime, but let's say it falls and we go in. It's like if we've not learned what occupation looks like, in the last 15 years and what it means to topple other governments, that's a problem. So I think that's a ridiculous idea. But most people stayed very calm. John Kerry stayed very calm. No one's ever seen John Kerry excited, so no one would know what that looks like any other way. But John Kerry stayed very calm. And now, of course, things have run their course, and now North Korea says we want to talk. Two interesting things that came out of this last thing to me, and then I'll be happy to take all your questions. Two interesting things that came out of this last dispute, which really began as when the United States pushed the UN to ratchet up sanctions because, again, North Korea is continuing their nuclear program. The UN agreed to do it, and that surprised everyone. Why did it surprise everyone? Because normally who's there protecting the North Koreans at the UN? It's the Chinese. The Chinese let this go, and they let it go through. And, people kind of took note. Even the U.S. folks at the UN sort of didn't think China would let this go, and they did. And this was a huge blow to the North Korean regime because China had sort of drawn a line and said, you can sanction up to a point, you can punish up to a point, but we're not going to let you cross that line. And they let them cross that line. And the belief is that China was trying to send this new leader a message. Don't go out and throw a temper tantrum this time. You need to stay calm. Because what China's starting to deal with now is a slight downturn in the economy. China's economy is still fine. It's growing. But there are some isolated regions, including north up in Manchuria, where the Chinese economy is starting to slow down. The last thing China wants is a refugee crisis. The last thing they want is a war over North Korea, because that's going to send millions of North Koreans into China. Right? China does not want that. So China's just sort of shot a warning shot over the bow of the new Korean leader by letting him do this. Well, again, he did throw a temper tantrum. It sort of didn't work. He threw a huge temper tantrum. But China refused to back him during this whole crisis, and I think that's interesting. Interesting point number one, that China really refused to back the North Koreans on this. I think interesting point number two was that I think it kind of tipped the hand of the United States, because then what we immediately did was we started forward deploying missile defenses, into Guam, into Hawaii, into places like this. And I think that was going to come anyway. And I think this sort of showed you that the U.S. is going to increasingly turn our military attention to Asia. It's always been there, but I think it's only going to increase. And I think it's going to increase because of China rising as a strategic rival. And the other reason it's going to increase, ironically, is global warming. Why global warming? Pretty soon, there's going to be enough meltage, there already has been enough meltage, and it will continue to do so, of Antarctica, such that you will be able to have a North Passage. Right? You'll be able to get from Europe to Asia over the top. Right? That means the most strategically important set of land right now in the world, or it's increasingly going to be one of the more strategic sets of land, are the Aleutian Islands. Right? Alaska to Russia, because that will control all access between the other side of the globe over to China. China wants more trade with Europe. That's an easy way to get it. We can control that, right? We can, if we have a significant military presence in Asia, we can sort of play police person of Asia. And so I think that the North Korean hubbub kind of sped up our plans and kind of showed our hand about how we're going to increasingly be involved in Asia. Military planners know this. It's not a secret per se, but I think it's not something that a lot of folks really realized how much I think we're going to be shifting some of our military attention to this region. So happy to take any questions about Syria, North Korea.
If you raise your hand, I'll come around with a microphone.
Yeah, you mentioned John Kerry. He's been around for, been doing his thing for just a little while. But can you give us your assessment of how good he is and where he's going, what his philosophy is, and how he will influence the office?
It's a great question. I still think it's a little too early. The first thing a new Secretary of State does, and frankly he's still kind of doing it, is the meet and greet. He's going around. He's been to the Middle East, met all the friends there. He's been to Asia. He's met the friends there. He's gonna do Europe. He's sort of going around, laying things out. What he's laying out is going to be trying to give people a sense of what his philosophy is. I think his philosophy, the general philosophy, will be one that I think you've seen consistent with Obama and that you saw with Hillary, which is, I think, someone please feel free to disagree with me, but I think what you've seen as Obama has got out of Iraq, which everyone gives him credit for, yes, he got us out of Iraq, but the Status of Forces Agreement signed by Bush meant that was going to happen anyway. As we've dwindled down in Afghanistan, it's almost more of the kind of Teddy Roosevelt, walk softly and carry a big stick kind of approach, in that, we've not been, again, we haven't gotten involved in Syria. We haven't really stuck our thumb too much in Egypt. We got briefly involved in Libya, but the U.S. involvement in that was pretty minor. Those are the NATO countries that were our NATO allies that were leading a lot of that. We're kind of keeping a bit of a lower profile. Even Hillary early on, or sort of midway through, Hillary had gotten the United States pretty involved in some of these South China Sea disputes with China. Then that kind of pulled back. We kind of pulled back out of that. So I think the U.S. after Iraq, after Afghanistan, after Libya, after the Arab Spring has changed the strategic situation in the Middle East, I feel like it's been a kind of a more low-profile foreign policy. I think he will continue that. I think it's going to be sort of the quiet strength approach, which Hillary was. The one thing that I do think is different is that Hillary was a phenomenal. I mean, even a lot of conservative Republicans will tell you they thought Hillary did a phenomenal job as Secretary of State. And what she did a good job at was sort of doing some of the bureaucratic reform, some of the insider politics within the state. She handled very well. There's a concern because she got her fingers in, and Condoleezza did this a little bit too. But Hillary really got in, and she figured out the staff. She kind of did some internal reform within state to try to make it a more efficient and a more responsive institution. The concern is that Kerry will be a little bit more aloof on those things, and he will just leave it to his staff, which could work out well. It might not. We don't know. But one reason I think Hillary drew such widespread acclaim was both for what she did internationally, but also what she was doing at Foggy Bottom, what she was doing in D.C. To do reform there. No one really knows. That the fear, the folks that I've talked to, is that Kerry's just not interested in that. He is a big picture person. He wants to be out there doing the meet and greets, meeting the heads of state, because after all, he thought he was going to be a head of state at one point. Of course, you could say the same thing about Hillary, I suppose. But the point is, I still think there's a little bit of time to tell. I think on the management side, Kerry will not be as good as Hillary, but all early signs are that he's going to continue a pretty similar philosophy. Sure.
Yeah, I'm just curious, how come you did not include Iran as part of the political situation? Sure. It seems like you just
ran out of time. I skipped Iran. I went to North Korea. That's right.
Iran,
Yeah.
Okay, what is your readings?
Yes. So Iran. Iran has obviously been a major issue in Middle East politics for a long time, really since '79, but even before then. But Iran's case, I think, let me talk short term and long term. Short term, the international community is continuing to push Iran to give up its nuclear ambitions. It's clear it has nuclear ambitions. I don't think they're going to be able to be stopped from developing. I just don't see them stopped without a major military offensive. That said, I think the odds are a major military offensive will fail. The Iranians aren't dumb. I mean, this is the Iranian nuclear program goes back to the Shah, right? I mean, sort of all of this, it's been the Islamic fundamentalists that have built these bombs. Yes, they've continued to build them. The Shah had dreams of building nuclear weapons as well. And he started doing it. And he started doing it under the Atoms for Peace program, which was a U.S. program from Eisenhower, who gave nuclear technology to a lot of our friends. The problem is your friends always don't stay your friends. And so because of that, because of then that turnover, you've got this nuclear program which now looks very dangerous. And, I have a particular view on this, which is I'm not sure it can be stopped. Iran is a very intelligent country, a lot of very well-educated engineers, scientists. They know how to do this. This is within their capability. Then the million-dollar question is, okay, let's presume it can't be stopped diplomatically. That means, do you stop it militarily, or do you let it go and try to contain it? Well, the military option is certainly there. It's on the table. No one's taken it off the table. But again, they're not stupid, right? They've buried these things. They've hidden them, right? We don't know where all of them are. And you can guarantee that if they've got a couple working within a few years, they'll use them if they're attacked. The million-dollar question is, if they're not attacked, can they be contained, right? Is this a country that you can deter from selling these weapons to terrorists, from using them against Israel or Europe or, God forbid, the United States? So my answer to that, and people don't all agree with this is a very controversial subject. I think yes. I'm actually optimistic that they can be deterred. I think Iran, yes, like the North Korean regime, they say, right, that Israel should be wiped off the map, that they're going to come, set fire to the United States. Right? They say these crazy things. But in reality, they actually show a fair bit of restraint in some of their foreign policy. In Iraq, we know that Iran was giving a number of weapons and a fair bit of training to Islamic forces fighting American troops. Absolutely. They could have been doing a lot more. They could have given them some of their massive stockpile of chemical weapons. They could have run even more weapons. They had the weapons. They could have been running even more weapons into Iraq to kill American soldiers. But they somehow they occasionally kept a lid on it. They did keep a lid on it. They let them in, but they could have done more. And they often would, in response to a U.S. sort of screaming about something they had done, would occasionally back off. So this shows, at least in terms of the United States, yes, they don't like us, we don't like them, but there's at least that kind of mutual respect there. Why can't we stop them? Why can't this be solved diplomatically? Iran lives in a bad neighborhood. Think about this if you're Iranian. Your neighbor's Iraq, invaded by the United States. Your other neighbor to the north is Afghanistan, invaded by the United States. Right? Your neighbor to the south is Saudi Arabia, your mortal enemy, armed to the hilt by the United States. Right? You're surrounded by the United States. Right? And of course, we sitting in the United States say, well, we would never do anything bad to them. But then, the Iranians say, well, in 1953, you reinstalled the Shah here. And in 1979, you tried to do these things. And yes, we did some bad things too. But, from their perspective, they live in a bad neighborhood. You buy guns when you live in a bad neighborhood. They're buying nukes when they live in a bad neighborhood. So the disaster scenarios they can't, that they truly are this messianic regime, they know they'll, right? I mean, because you have to think about this. If they do anything with these weapons, even if they let them get away, they're going to be answerable. And we have told them point blank, the world community has told them point blank, right? All bets are off. If you nuclearize and use one of these things or let them go, we will respond with nuclear weapons, right? We will turn Tehran into a parking lot, right? The whole city, right? And they know that. And we can all say, oh yes, but these folks, they're suicide bombers and they're crazy and they can't be deterred. But if that's true, then there's really nothing we can do, right? Why are we sending the 7th Fleet into the Persian Gulf, right? I mean, you either can deter them or you can't. I actually think they are deterrable. I do think it's a matter of time before they get these weapons. The reason for hope, that's all the bad stuff to keep you up at night, the reason for hope is that there's a major demographic shift getting ready to happen in Iran. The vast majority of the country is under 30 years old. Right? They don't remember the Shah. They don't remember the 79 revolution. They don't remember the Ayatollah. They know the internet. Right? One of the world's largest IKEA is built now off the coast of Iran. Right? They love to go shopping there. Right? You've got this whole, and you saw this 3 summers ago. This was the Green Revolution. These are the folks in the streets in Tehran trying to overthrow the government, or at least open up the government. Right? So I think what's likely to happen is as you get a new generation of clerics in power, and by the way, I think Ahmadinejad's days are numbered because he's now made a lot of the clerics angry. They see him as a loose cannon. I think he's kind of one misstep away from getting run out of there. But then the question is, who comes back? Remember, Khatami before him was sort of seen as a liberalizer, pro-Western. Turns out he governed during a bad economic crisis, so he kind of got run off, not because he kissed up to the West, but rather just the economy was in tatters, and he kind of got run out for that reason. So because of that, I do think over 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we're going to see a new regime in Iran. Is it going to be a regime that sort of runs into the arms of the United States? I doubt it, but it's also not going to be a regime that sort of shakes its fist at the United States all the time either. I think they'll be much more open to overtures from Europe and the United States in that Middle East game.
I think we have time for one more official question.
Okay. Two?
In Syria, could the NATO allies, including Turkey, tip the balance and reduce the bloodshed by enforcing a no-fly zone?
It's a great... Okay. So, yes. I don't know that they could tip the balance. They could certainly reduce the bloodshed. They probably, in the short run, would tip the balance. I think there's been more and more discussion of the no-fly zone. I think the analogy here, I think one of the more interesting analogies to the Syria situation is Bosnia, right, where we sort of dithered around for 4 years, starting in 1991. Things break out, they get bad, we consult, we train a little bit, we don't send a lot of weapons, things get bad. Some NATO peacekeepers actually go in to protect the safe areas. And the other reason I say that is one of the proposals on the table now is that you create safe corridors in Syria. So you create these corridors between some of the major cities of the different ethnic groups, and you allow them to travel safely, and that could be enforced by some international mandate. This is what you had in Bosnia, right? You had the safe havens, you had Srebrenica, you had Gorazda, you had these other cities in Bosnia that were set up as safe havens for NATO. The problem was eventually the Serbs bombed them, right? And they went to non-air methods of attacking these safe areas. I kind of think the same thing would happen, and that's what eventually drew NATO forces and American forces in. I wonder if you wouldn't have the same thing happen in Syria. You put in a no-fly zone, you put in some safe havens. Eventually, the Assad regime is going to get desperate because that's the only thing keeping them, the air power is the only thing kind of keeping them going. I think if it went away tomorrow, it would still be a slog, but I think it would certainly potentially reduce civilian deaths. The question is, does NATO have the political capital within these countries to do it? Could this pass muster in the U.S.? Maybe. I just wonder in Europe with the ongoing Euro crisis, and the economic situation there, whether they have any interest in undertaking operations like this. It didn't stop them going into Libya, but the cynic would say Libya had their oil. Right. Yeah. Let me say 2 words about Turkey. Turkey is very different than it was 5 years ago. They have a very powerful prime minister, Erdogan. Prime Minister Erdogan is sort of a different cut than what we've seen in Turkey in the past. He's an Islamist, and he openly admits he's an Islamist. I would argue 20 years ago, if he had done what he had done today and doing what he's doing today, the military would have come in, they would have arrested him, right? Turkey has a history of coups. 1960, 1971, 1980, and 1993, you had Islamists in power in Turkey, and the military said, enough, and they came in, they arrested them all, they dismissed parliament, and they said, 6 months, we're going to hold new elections. Get these Islamic guys out of there. We're a secular state. Erdogan has sort of effectively boxed in the military in Turkey. It's going to be hard for them to do that now. Erdogan has distanced himself from Israel, right? Turkey and Israel were tremendous, again, off the radar screen. Most people don't realize this. Turkey and Israel were tremendous friends for 25 years. Huge trade relations, joint military maneuvers, all with the encouragement of the United States, right? A big NATO ally in Turkey, a key strategic ally in Israel. And so the U.S. kind of brought these folks together. They were great friends. And then actually about 8 years ago, when some of the violence broke out in the West Bank and in Gaza, Erdogan, in his second term, sort of said, we're no longer friends with Israel. Now, he didn't end stuff overnight, but he started to take kind of a hard line against Israel. And in fact, Turkey right, because Turkey's aspiration is to be sort of the go-between, right? They want to be the translator of Europe and the United States to this crazy Middle East, right? And they want to say, we understand it, you need us, right? And so as a result, they were trying to get in the EU. They were making lots of overtures to solve some of these civil conflicts in some of these different Arab and Middle East countries. And now I think the Turks are done with Europe. There's still a large contingent in Turkey that still wants to be part of the EU. The EU's not going to let in Turkey. Not in this lifetime. Not in any kid's lifetime in Turkey are they going to become part of the EU, because the Europeans don't want, 8 million underemployed Turks with the prospects of crossing into their borders and taking their jobs, right? And so they don't want this. That said, Turkey would be a huge market for European goods. Things might get desperate enough in Europe that they bring the Turks on in a very limited way. But they've been rebuffed so much now, they're sort of like, okay, Europe, forget that. Let's go back to the Middle East. Israel, we're not so sure anymore, because he's a very nationalist, sort of Islamist. So Turkey's still trying to kind of find their role. I would argue that the Syria crisis has actually pushed them back a little towards Europe and towards the United States. They've needed help dealing with the refugee crisis on their hands from Syria. They've needed help trying to diplomatically get involved. They were actually becoming more friendly towards Syria, towards Iran. This has now broken that, because Syrian forces have occasionally gone into Turkey or threatened to go into Turkey to go after rebels there. That's made them very angry. So I think Turkey's in this very transitional moment right now, sort of like they were at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, where they're sort of looking for what's our role in the world, what are we going to do, are we going to be friends with Israel, the United States, Europe, are we going to keep being this sort of link between the Middle East and the quote-unquote West? And they've got this really powerful prime minister. Anytime you have a powerful leader, your first, whether it's Putin or, recently passed away, Thatcher, the question is what comes next? Right, because so much gets bound up in the kind of the cult of personality around these folks. What happens when they go? Will Turkey be able to continue on this sort of middling course, sort of balancing act course? I'm not as sure about that.
Great, thank you very much. Everybody, please join me in thanking Jon Pevehouse.
Oh, thanks very much. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I know every time I hear Professor Pevehouse speak, I just walk away and I have so much more knowledge, and I know I can share it with everybody that I talk to. But with everybody here, if you go home and talk to somebody else, you're helping to spread the Wisconsin idea. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and hope to see you again soon. On Wisconsin.